Shot of coffee, I trust. All right, since here we have, the CEO of Unicredit, then, he has to answer a lot of things. I'm rolling up my sleeves, took off my jacket, rolling up my sleeves so that, ready? Yeah, but you're the guest speaker here. Okay, so our next panel is essentially about how to revive growth and what recipes there are for reviving growth, because everything we discussed in the first panel is all well and fine as long as you have economic growth and as long as you obviously have banks that have the money to invest, companies that have the money to invest. And so now, as I said, we're sort of widening this pyramid of our conference to talk about how you revive growth through innovations and investments. And we're going to pick up on something that one of our panelists before, Salvatore, who I felt bad because I kept blocking him because he was sort of the representative of the quote-unquote traditional sectors, and whereas most of the discussion was on entrepreneurship. And so in this panel, we're going to talk a little bit more about certainly finance and the question of financing, but also how traditional companies can innovate, especially in Europe, where that is the bulk of the economic landscape of corporate Europe. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the word, rather than myself doing an interview, I'm going to pass the word to Marco Magnani, who's a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's about to publish a book that actually comes out next week. I don't have the cover. It's a new book. We don't even have the cover yet. Called "Creating Economic Growth," which looks at what lessons from around the world can Europe take. And so I'm going to let him kind of give the framework for this next panel, and then I'm going to pass the word on to Federico Ghizzoni, who's the CEO of Unicredit and who's going to answer some of the questions posed to him by some of the young people and by Riccardo. So, Marco, why don't you give us a framework for this next panel?
Thank you, Alessandra. So, this was a very interesting first panel, but I think the good news is that, in the message, I think, to some of the younger kids here in the room, is that you don't need to drop out of college in order to do a startup, in order to do innovation. You don't need to necessarily to be a poker player, and also you don't need to share a bathroom with 5 co-founders. I was kind of glad that the Cisco experience or track record came up, because just like when Nancy and Gianluca were born, it was the IBM experience. A little bit of framework is actually useful to then do innovation. As I always say, in order to learn how to think outside of the box and to be creative, you do first need to know what's inside the box. And so I think that's kind of the good news. The bad news is when we talk about innovations and growth, is that I think Europe, and we are here in the heart of Europe, is not thinking at innovation in the right way. The reason I'm saying that is because, first of all, there is a general agreement, certainly, that innovation is one of the major catalysts of growth. But what Europe and most European countries haven't understood yet is that when you are, as we are, as most of Europe is, on what is called the innovation frontier, you're not an emerging economy anymore like we used to be, after World War II. Like, there are many emerging economies in the world, so you can just count on the fact that you cut cost, the labor cost, and you just catch up. So you cannot rely on the catch-up effect, as it's called. Catch-up not as in the tomato sauce, but as in catching up with advanced economies. You cannot count on that. You cannot compete by increasing your productivity just by cutting cost, the cost of labor. You are now at the frontier, at the innovation frontier. So innovation not only is one of the variables to foster growth, is actually the single most important one, and it's actually absolutely crucial. And so if you realize that, and I'm not sure all European countries have really understood that, the mix, the recipe of the variables they have to work on is completely different. It's completely new. And I would mention 2 or 3 key things. One is the framework. When you're on the innovation frontier, you're an advanced economy, the framework, and what I put in the framework is anything from political stability to rules and regulations, which shouldn't be too many, by the way, to the tax system, which shouldn't be too harsh, all the way to the rule of law. So the framework has to be a strong framework when you are up there in the frontier, innovation frontier. The second very important element is having free and flexible markets, including the labor market. So it's not necessarily the cost of labor per se, it's really the flexibility of the labor market, having free market in terms of goods, services, people. The third aspect, which is crucial for innovation in advanced economies, is what I call human capital. And I love it because you have up here the two major components of human capital. One is talent, which is kind of the broad education, anywhere from secondary schooling to university to professional training. There's a lot of talk about professional training. So that's the education, having the talent and being able to train the talent so that it's ready for the marketplace. The second component, which is even more important than education and talent, is what I call the entrepreneurial education, the entrepreneurial culture. Why is that more important in terms of innovation than simple education? Because it's by creating an entrepreneurial culture and education that you create an environment where there's creativity, where there are what the economists call the spillovers, the externalities. So there's actually innovation. So those three things, from the framework to the free and flexible markets to the human capital, are the three key ingredients for an economy that is so-called advanced, that is on the innovation frontier. And Europe and the United States, that's where they are. The second reason why I think Europe is not thinking innovation and therefore the major component of growth in the right way is because innovation, let me be a little provocative here, but innovation is not just startups. Or if you want to put the other way around, startups is not the only way to innovate. As a matter of fact, in aggregate, you have a lot more growth coming from existing firms than you have from startups. And this is actually very intuitive if you think about it. It's been empirically proven, but it's very intuitively because in aggregate, if you look at the mortality rate of startups, you have a lot more growth coming from existing firms. So the first point is not only startups, but actually existing firms can provide a lot more growth than startups. The second reason why, by the way, nothing wrong with the startups. The startups are great because they are a great index of dynamism of an economy. But the key thing for policymakers is not necessarily to focus on the number of startups. You hear a lot of policymakers talking about, what can we do to increase the number of startups in a certain country? So they just throw money at startups, so you have a higher number. That's almost meaningless. What really counts is having the winners. So you want to focus on trying to support, whether it's direct to support or indirect support. I'm more for the indirect support via the framework rather than throwing money. You want to support the winners, not necessarily the number of startups. The second point, so existing firms versus startups. The second point is more, innovation doesn't necessarily mean having a lot of companies in high tech or biotech or all what I call the glamorous sectors, which are great. But I think Europe actually has a much bigger opportunity to, by pushing innovation in what I call the traditional sectors. Sometimes I want to push it, to the extreme here. Sometimes it's even what I consider very mature or even obsolete sectors. The bottom line is if you have, the best talent and ideas and the most money that goes after high tech and biotech and bioengineering, they tend to go to Silicon Valley, tend to go to San Diego, tend to go to Boston, Cambridge, around MIT. So it's fine to try to replicate to some extent Silicon Valley in Europe. There are some great examples, Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, even in Italy, the Politecnico di Torino and Milano are doing a great job, the Red Mile in Bergamo. But the biggest potential for Europe, and this is very true, I think, for Italy and Germany, two countries that have, where manufacturing is still very strong, there's a huge opportunity in innovating into traditional sectors. And by traditional sectors, I mean even things like food, agriculture, furniture, automotive, tires. Think about tires. Car tires are a commodity, but some tires are extremely expensive because there's been a lot of innovation in technology. Think about, we have Giovannini here who runs Guala. They make, closures, right? Closures is, could be considered as a commodity in a way. Well, it's not a commodity anymore. The level of innovation.
Tops.
Yeah, tops. The level of innovation
in
technology is absolutely. So this is a great example. Most of the clients of UniCredit are probably traditional firms. That doesn't mean that they didn't do any innovation. I mean, there's a huge potential there. So this is kind of the second point. The third point is, obviously the best innovation is the one we've heard Commissioner Katainen this morning talking about the need to invest more in R&D, more R&D spending. That's absolutely great. I mean, obviously there's a great correlation between R&D spending and innovation. It would be great to be able to invest in R&D and get innovation. That's the best innovation, by the way, because it's a longer term, it's more sustainable. So that's the ideal work. However, as you know, there are some budget constraints in most European countries. So you don't always have the money to invest in R&D. And by the way, in some countries, Italy being one of them, you have the backbone of the economy, which is made not by large multinationals, but the small and medium-sized companies. And guess what? They have a hard time. They don't have the capital. They don't have the mindset to invest in R&D. So that's very tough. There are ways around that, but it's very tough. So I'm not saying that R&D shouldn't be, the high road for innovation, but there's also there's innovation which I kind of like to call low-cost innovation. And don't get me wrong, but it's more like the creative innovation. It's more the on-the-job learning innovation. And it doesn't necessarily apply only to technological innovation. It also applies to, logistics, distribution, marketing, management of organizations, governance. So there's a whole sort of, whole different kind of innovation that can be done at very low cost without massive investments in R&D. That can be done in traditional firms that can increase their productivity in an amazing way and can foster growth. Just think for a second, I would just mention the SMEs, the small and medium enterprise companies, very strong in Germany as well, in Italy, in other European countries. A lot of them are family owned. Just think about what increase in productivity you could have by changing the management of organizations, by splitting the ownership and the management, by introducing a more transparent governance. So those are fairly low-cost innovations. They don't need huge investments in R&D. So I'm not saying they should replace the R&D investments because those are key and those are the hard work. But in a time of crisis, it's a good way to keep innovating. By the way, what's interesting is also that Europe also has to learn to invest more in R&D in the time of crisis. And what I find interesting, in the time of crisis, in the past 6-7 years, Europe has, with a few exceptions like Sweden, consistently cut on the R&D investments. And the idea is, if you're a company, particularly small and medium-sized companies, you need to survive. You're at war, basically, because you got a huge crisis. So what you cut the R&D, which you don't think is that useful, because it's a long-term thing. The United States actually have something to teach us in this, because I find it remarkable, in 2007, 2012, those 5 years, which were pretty tough years, you had an annual increase of spending in R&D, annual increase of 9.6%. And if you think about that, it takes a lot of courage to do that, but it's a smart move, because it's right when you have this type of downturn that you want to invest for the longer term. Not only want to survive, but you want to prepare yourself when the downturn finishes. So I think, again, to summarize, the good news is that you don't have to drop out of college to start. The bad news is Europe has to do a lot of changes and rethinking about innovation if we want to get it right, focusing more on existing firms, focusing more on traditional sectors, and learning how to take advantage of low-cost innovations, and of course, putting more emphasis also on R&D spending in a time of crisis.
Excellent. Thank you for
Thank
that.
you.
So, Marco, can you bring in some examples from, because your book obviously talks about, lessons for Europe, presumably lessons from everywhere else that Europe can bear, about this issue of, moving away from traditional funding and, what is needed. And then I'm going to move on to you, Marco, because you did a mini bond recently, one of the first to embark on this, and you'll explain, what it is. But I want you to focus specifically on how you use the money that is over the years that you've gotten, again, on innovation. I mean, you're our real live example of a company that actually makes things, right? And it's a thing. It's not a new technology. It's not internet. It's not viral, right? So I want you to say how your money flows in and out comes innovation, whatever that may be with this little thing.
I can also go react and disagree on a couple of things that I've heard here.
Absolutely, please do. And then I'm going to have a a few questions from the audience.
I do disagree that in Europe there's less entrepreneurial, what I call the entrepreneurial spirit or entrepreneurial creativity than in the US. I think the difference is that, so it's the DNA of European as it is, particularly of Italians as it is, and of Americans. The differences are, first, there's less incentive in general, and that's the framework the rules are too complicated, too many, they're too different. It's general incentive, not to mention taxes. The second huge difference is the perception of people that actually made it and had success. And I want to come back to that in a second when I had a comment on failure. To your point about investments and financing, I have two accounts, one at UniCredit for Europe and one at Citibank. Let me say that the moment in which I'm very glad to hear that UniCredit has got a great startup strategies and incubator and is very open and has got exposure to startups. But the moment in which I would learn that Citibank and UniCredit, two commercial banks, are primarily focused on doing innovations through startup, I would probably shut down my saving accounts there. The point being that the core business, the way I want a commercial bank to do innovation is exactly by financing companies like Voila, by financing existing, scalable, traditional companies that do innovation or do innovation internally within UniCredit. So those are the things. So this is also leads to your question, which is, do I really want a large commercial bank to compete with VCs or private equity at a later stage to give money to startups? I'm not really sure I want that to be the primary business. And so it's a different role that needs to be played by commercial banks. I found very interesting this point of partnership because in a way, the real innovation of many banks, large banks like UniCredit, is really to go back to the roots and recreate the regional local bank system, which used to be very effective because they worked in partnership with local companies. And so in a way, you think global, you think European, but you act, as Gandhi said, local, because if you lose that partnership, you cannot really help your client grow and grow with your client. And the partnership model is the one that I would, I think that is really the solution to how, to the kind of the dilemma that Giovannini brought up, which is, how do you get small and medium-sized enterprises to invest in R&D or R&D or do innovation and make investments in a time of crisis when, they don't have the mindset, they don't have the capital to do that. And I think, there's two answers, and they're both partnership answers. The first one is what is called in Italian filiera, which is kind of a vertical, supply chain where you have some, a leader, a multinationals, and then you got everybody else lined up. And that kind of works because it forces the followers, although your followers, to keep innovating. Otherwise, you become replaceable in the supply chain. So it's a good system. There's another, I think, concept of partnership, which I like better, which is, it's a more horizontal one, which is why I like to call it cluster, which is really, again, going back to the local level, trying to have the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs locally work together with a local bank or the larger bank that have local presence, with the universities, with the institutions, as a cluster. So cluster, literally means, a cluster, with so different actors work together. In that way, they share the risk of making investments in R&D. They can share even the knowledge, the know-how. That's the only way for SMEs, I think, to survive and to compete with multinational. I mean, it's one of the two ways. The other one is the supply chain. But in that, as a small company, you're really always on your toes, and you always have to be, you cannot depend from the leader. The last point I wanted to make is this on failure. And I think, again, I disagree a little bit. I mean, I think we're overemphasizing, and this is definitely something that happens in the US. I mean, I don't think failure is good or wrong per se. I mean, I think failure is bad, actually. I mean, to fail on something, that means you did something wrong. What is wrong is to punish somebody because, in a dramatic way, economically, and so they cannot have a second chance. But the other side of the coin is, which I think is very different in Europe from the United States, is really the perception that people have of successful entrepreneurs. So while in the US, if you made it, you're a successful entrepreneur, people generally think you're a good person, you're smart, and you had great ideas. In Europe, and in Italy this is very true, but all over Europe, particularly in Southern Europe, where there's a more Catholic type of culture, there's a little bit of a sense of guilt. okay, about making money. There's a little bit of sense of, there's also a perception of lack of transparency. You tend to think that if somebody made it, there's probably something wrong. There's a lack of transparency. So that is really, those I think are the differences. One is the framework, the incentive system, which is not right, because I agree with you, the rules should be very few and simple and consistent possibly. And the second one is the perception. If you have a negative perception of people who actually made it, why should you take a risk? And risk to fail, and even if you make it, you have this, people think that maybe you got there in a way that is not necessarily ethical or clean. So I think those are really the major differences that.
Absolutely. And so, Marco, did you get there in a way that was ethical and clean?
He couldn't say.
Considering he visits the jails in every city he goes to, I mean, makes you wonder.